Khaled Hassan, welcome to the Honest Report podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, you certainly are one of the most prominent researchers in geopolitics and national security, certainly on social media and traditional media as well. Now, what's interesting is that you talk about something that very few others talk about, and that is Egypt. In your mind, Egypt, of course, you are Egyptian in origin. Egypt is an ignored story in the Western news media. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, it's actually very interesting because you said something that I think really describes the situation perfectly. When you say Egypt is a blind spot for Israel and the U.S., I would argue it is definitely the most dangerous blind spot because it is a blind spot because they choose for it to be as such. Israel does not want to believe that what they believe is the foundation of Arab-Israeli peace, which is the Camp David peace treaty, is very fragile and it's essentially collapsing and has been collapsing since October 7th, as I warned. So they don't want to believe this. So they're sort of trying to just steer clear of this. Of this assessment, just ignore it, just bury your head in the sand and pretend it's not actually happening. Um, so the U.S. similarly, they have invested billions in arming the Egyptian army and making sure that they have strategic, uh, excellent strategic relationship with Egypt. So they decided, what, we're going to also bury our heads in the sand to an extent, and that allows Egypt to be the blind spot that it is today. So again, it's a decision. It's an Israeli American decision to just choose, to bury your head in the sand. What's actually very frustrating for me is I have the experience, working with Egyptians. I'm Egyptian. I was born in Egypt, lived in Egypt until I was 25. I was also a member of President Sisi's presidential campaign, the first one. So I worked with, people who are very, very, very close to President Sisi, and I know his inner circle very well. So when you look at this, and you realize people just choosing to, when I started warning of Egypt immediately after October 7th, and actually before October 7th, people just decided, oh no, Khaled, you're being alarmist, you're promoting some kind of conspiracy theory that, there could be war between Egypt and Israel. And, we're almost, over 2 years now after October 7th, and everyone is realizing, actually, hold on a moment, something really weird is happening. And it's very, very frustrating. But it's not new, this is the case for I specialize in strategic intelligence analysis. Strategic intelligence analysis is basically this art and science that looks at how, rivals and how friends behave. And that's very common in this field, that you would give a warning and that warning would be ignored by decision makers for, political reasons, for whatever. And then eventually someone regrets it and someone says, actually, hold on a moment, you're right here. We should have, considered this years ago. So yeah.
So Mohammed Morsi, of course, who was the Muslim Brotherhood president, was later of Egypt, was later deposed by al-Sisi, the current president of Egypt. There was a very big sigh of relief in Israel and Western capitals, and I think there was a real feeling that things were back to normal. But certainly, in your view, it's not back to normal. Tell us why.
So first of all, President Sisi is very, very, very smart, and this is what a lot of people sort of tend to not really um, take in consideration. He's extremely smart, and he has a very capable intelligence service, the Egyptian General Intelligence Service. It's very capable, uh, and what people don't know is that there is, we have the foundations in Egypt and in the Egyptian establishment, the foundations of anti-Israel, you know, hatred, or anti-Israel, whatever you want to call it. It's really very deeply rooted. And a lot of people thought, myself included, when President Sisi took over, that he's going to be the exact opposite of an Islamist, because he ousted Muhammad Morsi, who, like you rightly pointed out, was the Muslim Brotherhood president in Egypt. So, myself included, as I said, we all believed, he's going to be the exact opposite of an Islamist. But President Sisi was really exceptionally smart in, taking advantage of the circumstances. So when he took over, he wanted to say, I'm the opposite of an Islamist. I am essentially saving Egypt and the Middle East from Islamism, and he did. Let's face it, he did. But the very foundation of Islamism remain deeply rooted in the Egyptian establishment, whether it's the intelligence, whether it's the army. And when the circumstances changed after October 7th, and it became no longer, not only, after October 7th geopolitically, but also for Sisi's, for, well, Egypt's domestic circumstances, the economy and everything else, President Sisi completely flipped. He returned to, that very Islamist view on Israel and Jews largely, because it just became favorable for his you know for politics generally and for Egypt geopolitically. So that's what started. It just became, as I said repeatedly, after October 7th, relations with Israel and sort of having a positive relationship became not only a risk but also counterproductive for Egypt and President Sisi. So they decided, we'll just go the exact opposite way.
Okay, so help us understand a little bit what is happening on the ground then. I mean, anti Israel rhetoric, of course, in itself is nothing new, but you've also talked about an uptick in military activity in Egypt. Tell us a little bit about what's actually happening.
Yes. Actually, let me just correct you on one point there, because I think this is also a common misconception. When people say the rhetoric is not new, actually, it is new. Since Egypt had, the peace treaty with Israel, rhetoric from Egypt, from the state, from the head of the state, who was, Mubarak, and even Morsi after him, none of them really referred to Israel officially in official meetings and publicly as the enemy. President Sisi did so in a recent summit for the Arab League. He referred to Israel as the enemy, and that is unprecedented. It's unprecedented since President Sadat, essentially, and since the peace treaty. So, no, it's not entirely, that's nothing new. No, no, there is something new happening there. And he was the only one to do this, by the way, because this was after the Doha strike. So it was after the Israeli Air Force actually struck Hamas targets in Doha. What's quite ironic and quite interesting is that even the Emir of Qatar, the head of the state of Qatar, did not actually refer to Israel as the enemy, but it was President Sisi who referred to Israel as the enemy. So again, that's very new. That's unprecedented. On the actual and practical steps, I said since October 7th that Egypt is prepared to go to war. It's preparing to go to war. And today, Egypt has effectively gone to war. So let's look at the past 48 hours. You will see that Egypt has sent essentially troops and equipment and fighter jets to Somalia, because they believe that Israel has got some sort of conspiracy against Egypt by going to recognizing Somaliland and having an intelligence base or a military base in Somaliland, from which they can basically control the source of the Nile, and basically make sure that Egypt is at a very serious position and threatening position. So they believe there is war in the Horn of Africa, and that Israel is sort of surrounding them from source of the Nile, Ethiopia, working with the Ethiopians to prevent or reduce Egypt's access to the Nile water, and also Gaza. So they believe again Israel is surrounding them somehow. And over the past 48 hours, we have seen the Turkish head of the Turkish Air Force visit Egypt. We have seen over the past week that Egypt now has a base for Turkish drones, that Egypt also manufactures its own drones, and they use these drones now to strike targets in Sudan. We have seen the alliance on the move. The alliance, by referring to the alliance, by the way, I mean Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. They are on the move. This is a war footing. They're on the offensive. The Egyptian army is no longer, previously the Egyptian army used to always say, we are a defensive army. We defend Egypt. We don't go abroad. We don't go overseas. But this is probably unprecedented in terms of actually being on the offensive, going to Sudan, going to Somalia, and that's unprecedented. We've also seen the Minister of Defense in Egypt has been replaced. He's been replaced by someone who is actually far more capable, far more knowledgeable, far more organized, and far more aggressive. So, again, that's only the past week. If we go back to, since October 7th, I can tell you things that will probably horrify you and things that have been almost entirely ignored by Israeli decision makers.
So certainly, you can share with us more. Would love to hear more. What are some of the other things that have happened that you're able to share with us, Khalid?
So, Egypt has done something exceptionally smart. What they did is use the Camp David Treaty as leverage on the US. Because President Trump wants to be as the peace president and he wants to be seen as, the guy who brought peace to the region, Egypt uses the peace treaty with Israel as leverage on President Trump personally. And what they did is essentially say, we have red lines, and the red lines are we are not going to accept the Israeli presence in southern Gaza as long as there is, an Israeli presence in southern Gaza, especially, but also, more broadly in Gaza. We are going to have our troops in Sinai. So the troops in Sinai and the equipment and the infrastructure is, something again, this is more of a war footing, really. Like we're ready to go to war if Israel decides to, in their perspective, forcibly relocate Gazans into Sinai, try to do it somehow. So that's one thing. So they've been using this, again, the peace treaty for leverage. And by doing so, they have been able to make sure, that President Trump is actually pressuring Israel to give, the Egyptians the gas deal, for example, without any conditions. So, just give them the gas without demanding that they reduce the military presence in Sinai. They've successfully made sure that President Trump is on their side in this, and they've secured a huge win on this. That's just, again, that's just one point that most people really do ignore. The other thing is, Egypt has been also extremely successful in diversifying its military equipment. Egypt has been also extremely successful at actually introducing new technology to the army, new equipment, new partners. So, the alliance, which I referred to in September last year actually, as the most dangerous anti Israel alliance in the region, is the Turkish Egyptian alliance. We now see joint military production. They produce drones together. They produce more than drones. They also produce ammunition. The Turks now will also get involved in producing ammunition. So Egypt has domestically produced ammunition and ammunition that is bought from Europe. So Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, Eastern Europe as well as Turkey. So Egypt is it's fascinating how no one seems to be really talking about this, but I think Egypt has been outsmarting everyone in the region, including the Americans.
So, what is the big goal of Egypt? You talked about this massive $35 billion USD gas deal a couple months ago, which I think to a lot of people looked obviously like very wonderful news, normalizing news. But there's more happening here. What is Cairo seeking to achieve? Is it just looking to limit Israel's power and influence in Gaza, or is it looking to flex its own muscles? What's its major goal?
So that's actually a multi-layered question, and it requires a multi-layered answer, I would say. So number one, you're looking at Egypt, which has red lines, and these red lines are somewhat legitimate. So, Egypt believes that the Israeli presence in Sinai is against the peace treaty, which is arguably true. Like Israel should not be there. That's an argument based on agreements, and you can look at the agreements, and you can look at sort of the military presence. If you have the military presence of the Israelis in Gaza, then Egypt obviously says, okay, well, you shouldn't be there, so we're going to be in Sinai. So that's one point. The other point, which is also legitimate, at least from President Trump's view, is the whole issue with Ethiopia. Egypt is very worried about the dam that Ethiopia built, and they're worried about a reduction in their water resources. They now see that Israel is working with the Ethiopians. That's again the Egyptian view. So, we have to take action to prevent Israel having any leverage over Egypt by having any presence that could interfere with Egypt's access to the water of the Nile. So again, that seems, again, sensible. It's sort of a defensive approach. We need to make sure you don't have this leverage over us. It's quite understandable. Even if you don't agree with it, it's understandable. The other side is ideologically, the overwhelming majority of Egyptians believe, that there will be Armageddon, that there will be a war between the Muslims and Israel at some point, and this will, Egypt will play probably the leading part in this. So, again, on this, the Egyptians are joined by their Turks, the Turkish brothers, so who actually believe in this as well. So you see, an ideological alliance is forming around Israel. So if you're going to answer what they want from this, number one, they want to make sure that Israeli influence in the region is reduced, that it's actually challenged, that it's diminished, undermined, and minimized. So they want to make sure that Israel has no presence or influence in the Horn of Africa. And that's what they're doing now. They're doing this militarily now. So, it's past the point of negotiations and discussions. It's now, something it's an actual war now. We see drones, carrying out attacks. We see all that stuff. So it's an actual war, like sort of a proxy war, but, still a war, where the Egyptian and the Turkish armies are directly involved. So what they want to protect their interests. They want to prepare or be ready for what they believe is an inevitable war against Israel, and they want to diminish again, the Israeli presence in the region.
Khaled Hassan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.